Claire, stop embarrassing yourself. This family legacy was never meant for someone like you. My mother said it loud enough for everyone at the table to hear. Not angry, not emotional. Worse, calm, certain. The kind of certainty that only comes from repeating the same lie for so many years that it starts sounding like truth. Around us, silverware paused above plates. Conversations died in unfinished sentences. My cousin lowered his glass. My uncle suddenly became fascinated by the pattern on the tablecloth. Nobody looked at me. Nobody ever looked at me when my mother decided it was time to remind the room where I belonged. Or rather, where I didn't. The dinner was being held in honor of my grandmother, Margaret Whittaker. She had been dead for 36 hours. Her body hadn't even been buried yet. The flowers from the funeral home still sat near the front door. The scent of lilies drifted through the dining room like a ghost nobody wanted to acknowledge. Yet somehow my mother had already found a way to turn the evening into a celebration of Natalie. My sister sat 3 seats away, wearing a cream-colored dress that somehow managed to look respectful and expensive at the same time. People smiled when they looked at her. They always had. Natalie had inherited every gift that mattered in our family. Charm. Confidence. The ability to make people feel chosen. I had inherited silence. At least that was what everyone believed. "Mom," Natalie said softly. "Please." It sounded like a defense, but it wasn't. It was the kind of protest people make when they want credit for objecting without actually stopping anything. My mother reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "I'm simply being honest." Honest. The word nearly made me laugh. Instead, I picked up my water glass and took a slow sip. I had spent 35 years learning how not to react. That was my real family inheritance. Not River House. Not the Whittaker name. Endurance. The ability to survive a room determined to make you disappear. Across from me, my father stared into his wine. Martin Whittaker had mastered the art of absence while sitting directly beside someone. He never joined my mother's attacks. He never defended me either. He simply waited for storms to pass. The problem with people who spend their lives avoiding conflict is that eventually they become part of it. Margaret would have wanted the family legacy protected, my mother continued. Some people understand responsibility better than others. Everyone knew what she meant. River House. The old estate overlooking the Ashley River. 3 generations of Whittaker history. The house where every Thanksgiving photograph had been taken. The house where my grandmother had taught me how to identify antique maps and preserve fragile letters. The house everybody assumed Natalie would inherit. My mother had practically announced it before the will was even read. Natalie has always understood what family means. There it was. The familiar knife hidden inside a compliment. Natalie looked uncomfortable. Good. For once, somebody should. I looked down at my hands resting beneath the table. There was a sealed envelope inside my coat pocket. A plain white envelope that weighed almost nothing, and somehow felt heavier than the entire house. My grandmother's attorney had given it to me after her death. Nobody else knew about it. Nobody else knew Margaret had arranged something in secret during the final months of her life. My mother certainly didn't know. If she had, she would never have been smiling tonight. The thought almost comforted me. Almost. "Claire?" My mother's voice pulled me back. "Are you listening?" "I'm listening." "Then perhaps you understand why some traditions matter." I met her eyes. Blue eyes. The same color as mine. The same color as my grandmother's. For a second, something flickered across her face. Irritation. Maybe even unease. Then it vanished. "I understand traditions," I said. "Better than most." The room went quiet again. My mother hated it when I answered calmly. Anger she could dismiss. Tears she could weaponize. Calmness unsettled her. It suggested I might not be playing the role she assigned me anymore. She gave me a tight smile and returned to her conversation with Natalie. Just like that, I became invisible again. The strange thing is that invisibility hurts most when it comes from people who are supposed to see you. If a stranger ignores you, it means nothing. When your own family does it for decades, it begins to rewrite the way you see yourself. I spent most of my 20s believing there was something fundamentally wrong with me, something everyone else could detect. Some defect hidden beneath my skin. Why else would a mother love one daughter effortlessly and struggle to tolerate the other? Why else would every family gathering leave me feeling like a guest who forgot to leave? I remember being 9 years old and winning a regional history competition. My teacher called my parents personally because she was proud. My mother congratulated me, and then spent the drive home talking about Natalie's upcoming piano recital. I remember being 14 and making honor roll while Natalie failed 2 classes. Somehow, dinner that night became a discussion about how much pressure Natalie was under. I remember being 17 and standing alone in family photographs because someone always needed to take the picture. Somehow that someone was always me. Thousands of moments, tiny cuts, nothing dramatic enough to explain to outsiders. Everything painful enough to leave scars. The only person who ever seemed to notice was Margaret. My grandmother never treated me like a burden. She never acted as though my existence complicated some invisible story everyone else understood. At River House, I wasn't the difficult daughter. I wasn't the quiet daughter. I wasn't the disappointment. I was simply Claire, the girl who loved old books, the girl who asked questions, the girl who stayed after everyone else left and helped stack chairs. "You pay attention," she once told me. "Most people spend their lives talking. You spend yours noticing." Nobody had ever said anything like that to me before. I carried those words for years, especially on the days when my mother made it clear she wished she'd been given a different daughter. Dinner dragged on. Stories about Margaret filled the room. Most of them weren't even true. My mother positioned herself at the center of every memory. Natalie laughed at the right moments. My father refilled glasses. The performance continued. Eventually, people began discussing River House openly. They stopped pretending. "Natalie will take wonderful care of the property," one aunt said. "Margaret would be proud." My mother beamed. Natalie smiled politely. Nobody asked what Margaret actually wanted. Nobody seemed interested in that detail. I felt the envelope pressing against my ribs. For 6 months before she died, my grandmother had been working on something. I knew that much. She'd become secretive near the end. She would stop talking whenever my mother entered the room. She made unexpected appointments with attorneys. She asked strange questions about family history. More than once, I caught her studying Natalie with an expression I couldn't understand. Then, one autumn afternoon, sitting on the porch at River House while the river reflected the orange glow of sunset, she had taken my hand. "Some truths arrive late," she said quietly. "That doesn't make them less true." I asked what she meant. She only smiled. "You'll understand eventually." At the time, I thought she was talking about death. Now I wasn't so sure. The dinner finally ended after 10. People gathered coats. Hugs were exchanged. Condolences repeated. The performance closed for the evening. I stepped outside into the cool South Carolina night and inhaled deeply. The air felt cleaner away from the house. Behind me, laughter drifted through the windows. My family continuing without me. Some habits never change. I walked toward my car but stopped before opening the door. The envelope was still there, waiting. For a moment, I considered opening it immediately beneath the porch light. Instead, I sat inside the car and stared through the windshield. My hands rested on the steering wheel. My pulse sounded unnaturally loud. Finally, I pulled the envelope free. My name was written across the front in my grandmother's handwriting. Claire. Nothing else. No explanation. No instructions. Just my name. I broke the seal. Inside was a folded letter. 1 page. Cream-colored stationery from River House. I unfolded it carefully. The paper trembled slightly between my fingers. Not because of the wind, because of what I suddenly knew. Whatever came next would change something forever. I read the first line, then the second. By the time I reached the end, I was staring at the words without breathing. My grandmother's final message contained only a few sentences. But one of them shattered everything I thought I understood about my family. The house was never meant for the daughter they displayed. It was meant for the one they tried to erase. Beneath that sentence was the name of her attorney, and one final instruction: "Come alone. There are documents you must see before the reading of the will." I sat in the darkness for a very long time. Somewhere inside the house, my mother was probably already planning how River House would pass to Natalie. Somewhere inside that house, everyone still believed they knew how this story ended. They were wrong, and for the first time in my life, I had the feeling that my grandmother had spent her final months making sure the truth would survive long enough to prove it. I didn't sleep that night. I tried. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling while shadows moved across the walls of my apartment. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw my grandmother's handwriting. The house was never meant for the daughter they displayed. It was meant for the one they tried to erase. I must have read those words 50 times before dawn. By sunrise, they no longer felt like a sentence. They felt like a key. The problem was that I still had no idea what door it opened. My apartment overlooked a narrow street lined with old brick buildings. Charleston was just waking up when I finally gave up on sleep and made coffee. The smell filled the kitchen. Biscuit, my orange tabby, jumped onto the counter and stared at me with the judgmental expression only cats seem capable of maintaining for entire lifetimes. I know, I told him. This is probably a terrible idea. He blinked once and turned away. Even the cat seemed tired of watching me overthink everything. By 9 o'clock, I was sitting at my desk inside the Charleston Historical Preservation Museum, where I worked as an archival specialist. Most people imagine museums as exciting places full of discoveries. In reality, my days were usually spent cataloging records, restoring fragile documents, and chasing paperwork through government databases. I loved every minute of it. Old documents had always made more sense to me than people. Papers didn't lie because they were afraid. Records didn't manipulate because they wanted approval. The truth might be buried inside them, but it existed. Human beings were far more complicated. Around noon, my phone vibrated. The screen showed a familiar name. Natalie. I stared at it before answering. "Hey," she said brightly. "You disappeared fast last night." I was tired. "Well, Mom's still talking about the funeral arrangements." I almost laughed. Of course she was. My mother could turn grief into project management if given enough time. That sounds exhausting. You have no idea. Natalie paused. Listen, I know she was hard on you yesterday. Hard on you. Such a gentle phrase for 35 years of emotional exile. She didn't mean anything by it. There it was. The sentence every family uses when they want injustice to remain comfortable. Right, I said. Claire? Yeah? You know she loves you. I looked across my office at shelves filled with letters written 100 years ago by people long dead. Strange how strangers from history sometimes felt more honest than your own family. Does she? Silence. Then Natalie sighed. I'm trying here. I know. And I meant it. Natalie wasn't cruel. She had simply grown up inside a version of reality that always centered her. It wasn't entirely her fault. Anyway, she continued, sounding relieved to move on. The reading of the will is next week. Mom thinks everything should go smoothly. My grandmother's letter flashed through my mind. Everything should go smoothly. Somehow I doubted that. After we hung up, I opened a storage box containing correspondence from the 19th century and tried to focus on work. It didn't help. My mind kept drifting backward, back to childhood, back to River House, back to Margaret. Memory is a strange thing. It doesn't arrive in order. It comes in fragments. A porch swing moving in the summer breeze. The smell of river water at sunset. The sound of my grandmother shuffling a deck of cards. I remembered being 10 years old and arriving at River House after another miserable family gathering. Natalie had spent the afternoon showing everyone a dance routine she'd learned. The adults applauded. My mother cried because she was so proud. I had spent most of the day sitting on the dock reading a book. When we arrived home, my grandmother found me hiding on the back porch. What happened? She asked. Nothing. She sat beside me. Claire. Even then, she had a way of saying my name that made lying feel impossible. Nobody cared about my project, I admitted. The history one? I nodded. The one that won first place? Another nod. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something I never forgot. The world is full of people who only notice noise. Don't mistake that for wisdom. I didn't fully understand at 10 years old. I understood now. My grandmother noticed things other people missed. She noticed who cleared plates after dinner. She noticed who called when there wasn't a holiday. She noticed who stayed. Looking back, I think she spent years watching our family from a distance and seeing truths everyone else preferred to ignore. By the end of the workday, I had convinced myself not to think about the letter anymore. That lasted approximately 7 minutes. The moment I reached my car, curiosity returned. By the time I arrived home, it had become obsession. I reread the letter. Then I noticed something I'd missed before. At the bottom of the page, beneath my grandmother's signature, there was a handwritten note. 3 words. River House remembers. I stared at them. What did that even mean? Houses didn't remember anything. People remembered. Unless she meant documents. Records. Evidence. My grandmother had spent decades preserving family history. If anyone understood the power of paper trails, it was Margaret Whittaker. Suddenly, I remembered something else. About 6 months before she died, she had asked me an odd question while we sat on the screened porch overlooking the river. Do you know what survives longest? She asked. I guessed photographs. Then furniture. Then buildings. She shook her head every time. Records, she said. People can lie. Memory can fail. Records stay stubborn. At the time, it felt like another one of her lessons. Now it felt like a clue. My phone buzzed again. This time it was my mother. I considered letting it go to voicemail. Instead, against my better judgment, I answered, "Claire. No greeting. Just my name. Hi, Mom. Natalie says you sounded upset today." "Of course she did. I'm fine." "Good." A pause. "We need everyone focused right now. This family has responsibilities." Responsibilities. Another Whitaker favorite. Usually translated to stop making things inconvenient. "I understand. Do you?" Her voice sharpened slightly. "Because lately you've seemed distant." I nearly laughed. Distant. I had spent my entire life standing at the edge of the family photograph. Now suddenly I was the one creating distance. "I'm grieving Grandma." "We all are." The words came too quickly. Rehearsed. Then she added, "Margaret wanted harmony. Remember that. My grandmother wanted truth." The certainty arrived so suddenly it surprised me. For years I had accepted my mother's interpretation of everyone around us. Margaret would want peace. Margaret would want unity. Margaret would want family first. But what if my grandmother had spent decades watching a lie grow larger and larger? What if the letter was her final attempt to stop it? "Claire," my mother said. "Are you still there?" "I'm here." "Good. Then let's avoid unnecessary drama next week." Unnecessary drama. Another phrase that really meant silence. "Of course," I said. She seemed satisfied and ended the call. I sat alone in my apartment listening to the deadline. Then I looked down at the letter again. Riverhouse remembers. Somewhere inside the old estate overlooking the Ashley River, my grandmother had hidden something. Not treasure, not money. Something far more dangerous. The truth. And for the first time, I began wondering if the reason my mother had spent my entire life pushing me away had nothing to do with me at all. Maybe I wasn't the problem. Maybe I was the reminder. Maybe every time she looked at me, she saw something she desperately wanted forgotten. The thought followed me into the night. It sat beside me while I made dinner. It watched from the corner while I fed Biscuit. It lingered long after midnight. Then, just before sleep finally claimed me, another memory surfaced. One of the last conversations I ever had with Margaret. We were sitting on the dock. The river reflected moonlight like liquid silver. She looked older than I had ever seen her. Smaller somehow. Fragile, yet her eyes remained sharp. "There's something I need you to remember," she had said. "When the truth arrives, people who benefit from lies rarely welcome it." I asked her what truth she meant. She smiled sadly. "The one your mother has been running from for most of her life." Before I could ask another question, she changed the subject. At the time, I thought she was confused. Now, lying awake in darkness, I realized she had been warning me. And somewhere deep inside my chest, beneath years of self-doubt and disappointment, something unfamiliar began to grow. Not anger, not revenge, certainty. For 35 years, I had believed I was standing outside the story. But what if I had been at the center of it all along? And if that was true, what exactly had my mother spent decades trying to hide? The call from Samuel Price came 3 days later. I knew who it was before I answered because almost nobody called anymore. People texted. People emailed. Phone calls usually meant death, emergencies, or lawyers. Since my grandmother had already handled the first category, I assumed this was the third. "Miss Whitaker?" His voice sounded exactly the way old law offices smell. Careful, quiet, permanent. "This is Samuel Price, your grandmother's attorney." I closed the archive file I had been pretending to read. "I've been expecting your call." A brief silence. "Your grandmother thought you might say that." Something about the sentence tightened my chest. Margaret had been gone for less than a week, yet somehow she still seemed 3 steps ahead of everyone. "Can you come by my office tomorrow morning?" Samuel asked. "Alone." The same word from the letter. "Alone." "Yes." "Good. Bring no one. Discuss this with no one." Your grandmother was very specific. After the call ended, I sat motionless for several seconds. Around me, the museum hummed with ordinary life. Visitors drifted through exhibits. Tour guides repeated practice stories. Somewhere a school group laughed. The world continued exactly as it had the day before. Yet something was changing beneath the surface. I could feel it, like a fault line shifting underground. The next morning, I drove across Charleston beneath a gray sky threatening rain. Samuel Price's office occupied the second floor of an old brick building near Broad Street. The place looked unchanged since the Reagan administration. Dark wood, brass fixtures, shelves packed with leather-bound volumes nobody under 50 had touched in years. A receptionist led me down a narrow hallway and into a conference room. Samuel was already waiting. He stood when I entered. "Claire. Mr. Price, please sit." He waited until the door closed before speaking again. Then he slid a thick manila folder across the polished table. "Your grandmother instructed me to give this to you before the reading of the will." I looked at the folder but didn't touch it. "What is it?" "The reason she amended her estate plan." My pulse quickened. "Amended?" Samuel nodded. Last October." Around the same time Margaret had begun asking strange questions. Around the same time she started warning me about truth and lies. "My mother thinks Natalie is inheriting River House." "Your mother thinks many things." The lawyer's expression remained neutral. "Some of them are incorrect." I stared at him. What exactly did my grandmother change? He folded his hands together. "Before I answer that, there's something you need to understand. Margaret Whittaker was one of the most meticulous clients I have ever represented. She never acted impulsively. She never changed major legal documents without evidence." "Evidence?" The word immediately captured my attention. "Evidence of what?" Samuel took a deep breath. Then he opened the folder and removed several documents. "Your grandmother believed there was a significant falsehood at the center of your family." The room seemed to shrink slightly. "What kind of falsehood?" "One involving inheritance." He slid the first paper toward me. It was a copy of Margaret's amended will. My eyes scanned the pages quickly, most of the legal language blurred together. Then I reached the section concerning River House. My breath caught. The property, along with the Whittaker Preservation Trust, would pass to Margaret Whittaker's verified biological descendant. Verified biological descendant. I read the sentence twice. 3 times. "What does that mean?" I asked quietly. Samuel met my gaze. "It means exactly what it says. Natalie is her biological descendant." The words came automatically. The assumption I had carried my entire life. Samuel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into the folder again and placed another envelope on the table between us. Unlike my grandmother's letter, this one carried official markings, laboratory logos, legal certifications. "Margaret instructed me not to open this," he said. "Only you." Suddenly I didn't want to touch it. Whatever was inside felt dangerous. Not physically, emotionally. The kind of truth that rearranges memories. "What is it?" "I know the nature of the test." Samuel's voice remained calm. "I do not know the result." My fingers hovered over the envelope. "Why?" "Because your grandmother paid a considerable amount of money to ensure independent verification." My heartbeat was suddenly loud. "Verification of what?" "Family lineage." The words landed like stones. I looked down at the envelope, then at Samuel, then back at the envelope. Somewhere deep inside myself, a terrible possibility was beginning to form. Not a conclusion, just a shape, a shadow. Slowly, I broke the seal. The report inside was nearly 30 pages long. Charts, technical language, laboratory summaries. I skipped most of it and turned directly to the findings section. Then I stopped breathing. The first result concerned Margaret. Genetic analysis confirmed direct biological relationship between Margaret Whittaker and Claire Whittaker. Probability exceeding 99.9%. That part wasn't surprising. The second result nearly dropped me out of my chair. Genetic analysis excludes direct biological maternal line relationship between Margaret Whittaker and Natalie Whittaker. I stared at the page, then stared longer. The words refused to change. Excludes. Not uncertain. Not unlikely. Excludes. "No," I whispered. Samuel said nothing. "No." I read the paragraph again. And again. My hands had started trembling. "There has to be a mistake. The laboratory is fully accredited. Then the sample is wrong. Chain of custody was documented. This doesn't make sense." Samuel remained silent. Lawyers understand the value of silence better than most people. Eventually I looked up. "You knew. I suspected your grandmother had reason for concern." "Natalie isn't." I couldn't finish the sentence. My mind was moving too fast. Images flashed through my head. Family photographs, birthday parties, Christmas mornings. Natalie sitting at the center of every frame. Natalie being praised, celebrated, protected. Natalie, the daughter my mother adored. Natalie, the heir everyone expected. Claire, Samuel's voice softened slightly. There's more. More. Of course there was more. There was always more. He handed me another document. This one wasn't from a laboratory. It was older. Much older. A photocopy of a legal filing. Arizona, Maricopa County. The date was 37 years earlier. My stomach dropped. What is this? A court record your grandmother located through private investigators. I scanned the page. Adoption proceedings. Petitioners. Evelyn Whitaker. Martin Whitaker. I stopped reading. For a long moment I simply stared. The room had become strangely quiet. Natalie was adopted, I finally whispered. Yes, my parents never told her. No. They never told anyone. Samuel nodded slowly. Margaret believed only a handful of people knew. I leaned back in my chair. Everything felt distant, unreal. The kind of shock that doesn't arrive as an explosion. It arrives as numbness. A quiet collapse of certainty. 35 years. 35 years of believing Natalie was the golden child because she was somehow better, smarter, more lovable, more worthy. 35 years of wondering why my mother looked at her with pride and looked at me with disappointment. 35 years of assuming the defect lived inside me. What if it never had? What if the entire foundation was rotten? Why would they hide this? I asked. Samuel exhaled. I can't answer that. But my grandmother had tried. Somewhere inside the folder, Margaret had left clues. I could feel it. Evidence, records, proof. The things she trusted more than memory. There's another item. Samuel slid a final document toward me. A handwritten note from Margaret. The paper looked fragile, older than the others. I recognized her handwriting instantly. Claire, if you are reading this, then I was right to trust your judgment. Before you do anything else, understand one thing. This is not Natalie's fault. She is not the lie. She was raised inside it. My vision blurred slightly. I blinked, then continued reading. The truth I spent years trying to understand is not about who belongs. It is about why someone worked so hard to make you feel like you didn't. Find the answer before you decide what to do. Love always, Grandma. I lowered the note slowly. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Samuel asked the question I had been avoiding. What happens now? I looked at the stack of documents spread across the conference table. The adoption records, the amended will, the laboratory report, a lifetime of assumptions dying quietly on polished wood. Now? I said. Now I find out why. Because one thing still didn't make sense. If Natalie had been adopted, why had my mother spent decades treating me like the outsider? I was her biological daughter, her actual child. Logic said I should have been the favorite. Instead, I had spent my entire life sitting at the edge of the table, watching someone else receive the love that should have come naturally. There was a reason. There had to be. And somewhere inside the records, my grandmother spent her final months collecting. That reason was waiting. Hidden, buried, preserved. Like every dangerous truth. I gathered the documents carefully and slid them back into the folder. Then I stood. Mr. Price. Yes? I think my grandmother knew exactly what she was doing. For the first time all morning, Samuel smiled. So do I. As I walked toward the door, another thought struck me. Something my grandmother had said months earlier on the porch at River House. Some truths arrive late. That doesn't make them less true. I understood now. The truth had arrived. But it hadn't arrived alone. It had brought a question far more frightening than the adoption itself. If Natalie wasn't the daughter my mother gave everything to because of blood, then why had my mother chosen her over me for 35 years? And what secret was important enough to destroy one daughter in order to protect another? For the next 4 days, I lived 2 separate lives. The first was visible. I went to work. I answered emails. I cataloged historical records. I smiled politely at museum visitors and attended staff meetings where people argued about preservation budgets and exhibition schedules. The second life existed underneath everything else. In that life, I spent every spare minute pulling apart 35 years of family history, one document at a time. The strange thing about discovering a secret is that it changes the shape of your memories before it changes anything else. Suddenly, every conversation feels suspicious. Every silence becomes evidence. Every story you once accepted starts looking incomplete. I found myself replaying childhood moments with new eyes. My mother's constant criticism, her coldness, the way she seemed irritated by my successes rather than proud of them. For most of my life, I had assumed I simply disappointed her. Now I wasn't so sure. By Thursday evening, my dining table had disappeared beneath stacks of papers. Samuel had given me copies of everything my grandmother collected: legal filings, private investigator notes, financial records, handwritten letters. The woman had built a case. Not because she wanted revenge, because she wanted certainty. Margaret had spent her life believing truth mattered, even when nobody else did. Biscuit sat among the documents like a furry supervisor while I worked. Outside, rain tapped softly against the apartment windows. Inside, I followed paper trails. The first major clue came from a series of letters exchanged between my grandmother and someone named Eleanor Briggs nearly 30 years ago. At first, the correspondence seemed ordinary. Two older women discussing family matters. Then one sentence stopped me cold. Evelyn cannot bear looking at the younger girl. Every time she does, she remembers what happened. I read the line 3 times. Younger girl. Me. What happened? The letter offered no explanation. Just enough information to create another question. I kept reading. More fragments emerged. References to arguments. Mentions of secrets. Hints of tension surrounding my birth. Never direct. Never complete. Like people circling something too dangerous to name. By midnight, my head hurt. I pushed away from the table and rubbed my eyes. That was when I noticed a sticky note attached to one of the investigator's reports. The handwriting belonged to Margaret. Talk to Lillian. She knows more than she ever admitted. Lillian, my mother's older sister. Aunt Lillian lived outside Savannah and had spent most of my life quietly avoiding family drama. Unlike my mother, she never enjoyed controlling rooms. Unlike my father, she never hid from conflict. She simply stayed away from both, which suddenly made her very interesting. The next morning I called her. She answered on the 3rd ring. Claire? Surprise filled her voice. Everything okay? I'm not sure. Silence. Long enough to matter. You found something. It wasn't a question. I sat up straighter. Why would you say that? Because your grandmother was stubborn. And because she spent the last year of her life making phone calls she shouldn't have been making. My pulse quickened. Aunt Lillian. Another pause. Then a sigh. The kind people release when they realize a secret has finally reached the end of its life. What do you know? She asked softly. Natalie was adopted. Silence. And Grandma spent months investigating something. More silence. Then, I wondered how long it would take. I closed my eyes. You knew. Some of it. How much? Enough. My grip tightened around the phone. Then tell me. The line remained quiet for several seconds. When Lillian finally spoke again, her voice sounded older than I remembered. Your mother couldn't have children. The sentence hit harder than I expected. What? Not for years. That's impossible. No. Lillian sounded tired. It isn't. I stood and walked toward the window. Rain drifted across Charleston beneath gray clouds. She had Natalie. She adopted Natalie. Then she had me. 2 years later, I frowned. I don't understand. Neither did your mother. The answer made no sense. What does that mean? Lillian inhaled slowly. For almost a decade, your parents tried to have children. Doctors told them it probably wouldn't happen. Your mother built her entire identity around that pain. Then they adopted Natalie. Everybody celebrated. Everybody moved on. The story was complete. Until I was born. Exactly. My chest tightened. Something was beginning to take shape. Something ugly. You're saying my existence ruined the story. I'm saying your existence changed it. I stared through the rain. And she blamed me? Not consciously at first. Lillian's voice softened. But every time she looked at you, she was reminded that the narrative she spent years building wasn't true anymore. Narrative. Story. My grandmother had spent years talking about stories. About the danger of believing them too completely. So she loved Natalie because Natalie represented the version of her life she wanted. And you represented reality. The words landed like stones. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, I whispered, "That's insane." Yes, I was her daughter. I know. I was a child. I know. My eyes burned unexpectedly. Not because the information was new. Because hearing another human being say it aloud made it real. For years I had searched myself for the flaw. The defect. The reason I wasn't enough. Now the answer stood in front of me. There had never been a defect. There had only been a secret. Did Grandma know? I asked. Eventually. How? Lillian laughed sadly. Because Margaret noticed everything. She noticed who got praised, who got blamed, which daughter received grace, and which one received judgment. That sounded exactly like my grandmother. She confronted your mother several times. And? Evelyn denied everything. Of course she did. Then Grandma stopped arguing and started documenting. A chill moved through me. Suddenly I understood why Margaret had spent months gathering records. Why she ordered investigations. Why she amended her will. She wasn't trying to punish anyone. She was preserving the truth before she died. There's something else, Lillian said quietly. My stomach tightened. What? Your mother wasn't the only one who knew. Who else? Your father. I closed my eyes. Somehow that hurt more. My mother's cruelty had always been visible. My father's silence felt different. He let it happen. Yes. For 35 years. Yes. Another silence settled between us. Then Lillian said something I would think about for weeks afterward. People always talk about active cruelty, Claire. They forget passive cruelty exists too. I thought about every dinner where my father looked away. Every holiday. Every insult. Every moment he could have said enough. He never did. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Because I'm tired. Her voice cracked slightly. Because your grandmother spent years carrying this burden and now she's gone. She paused. And because you deserve the truth. When the call ended, I sat alone in my apartment for nearly an hour. Not moving. Not thinking. Just existing inside the wreckage of a story I had believed my entire life. Eventually, I returned to the documents. This time I knew what I was looking for. Not proof of Natalie's adoption. I already had that. Not proof of inheritance. That was settled too. I was looking for motive. And once I knew where to look, the evidence appeared everywhere. Letters, notes, family calendars, records of counseling appointments my mother attended after my birth, fragments, pieces. Enough to reveal the outline of a woman trapped inside a story she couldn't let go of. By midnight, one truth stood above all the others. Natalie had never been my rival. She had been another victim. Raised inside a lie she didn't create. Loved for reasons she never understood. Used as proof of a version of history my mother desperately wanted preserved. The realization brought no satisfaction, only sadness. And just as I was preparing to pack away the documents for the night, my phone lit up with an incoming call. My mother. I stared at the screen, then answered. Hello? Claire. Her voice sounded unusually warm, almost affectionate. The change was so unnatural it immediately made me suspicious. Mom. I was thinking about you. That had never been a promising beginning. Okay. The family gathering next Saturday is important. There it was, the real reason for the call. I know. I want everything to go smoothly. I leaned back in my chair. So do I. Good. Her voice softened further. Because Natalie deserves a beautiful day. My eyes drifted toward the stack of documents beside me. The adoption records. The letters. The lies. Does she? I asked quietly. Silence. Then. What does that mean? I looked at the rain sliding down my apartment window and realized something profound. For the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of her. Nothing, I said. Just thinking. But after we hung up, I knew exactly what I was thinking. My mother was nervous. She sensed something. Maybe not the truth itself, but the approach of it. And for the first time in 35 years, the woman who had always controlled the story no longer knew what came next. The morning of the gathering arrived wrapped in sunshine, so perfect it felt almost offensive. The Ashley River glittered beyond the trees, the water smooth as polished glass. And for a brief moment as I drove toward River House, I understood why people spent their entire lives believing appearances. Beautiful things make terrible disguises. The folder rested on the passenger seat beside me. Inside it were the adoption records, the investigators' findings, the letters my grandmother had preserved for decades, and the amended will that nobody except Samuel Price and I knew existed. 35 years of secrets fit into a single folder. 35 years of damage fit into a few sheets of paper. That realization stayed with me as River House appeared beyond the oak trees. The white columns gleamed in the sunlight. The wide porches overlooked the river exactly as they had throughout my childhood. Every memory I had of feeling safe lived somewhere inside those walls. Every memory I had of being seen lived there too. My grandmother used to say that houses absorbed the people who loved them. Looking at River House now, I hoped she was right. The driveway was already crowded. Luxury cars lined the gravel path. Relatives drifted across the lawn carrying drinks and small plates of food while catered tables stood beneath white tents overlooking the water. My mother had transformed the reading of the will into a social occasion. Again, from a distance it looked less like a legal meeting and more like a celebration. Everyone assumed they knew how the day would end. Natalie would inherit the estate. My mother would receive congratulations. The Whitaker legacy would continue exactly as it always had. Nobody understood they were standing inside the final hours of a story that had been running for more than 3 decades. I parked and sat in silence for a moment before stepping out of the car. My grandmother's last note rested inside my purse. The one of them who was never cruel. I repeated the words silently. Not because I felt particularly kind. At that moment I didn't. Part of me wanted my mother to experience every ounce of humiliation she had spent years handing to me. Part of me wanted her to feel what it was like to sit at the edge of the table while everyone else decided who mattered. But every time those thoughts surfaced, I heard my grandmother's voice. The one of them who was never cruel. It felt less like praise now and more like a challenge. Natalie spotted me almost immediately. She stood near the front porch greeting arriving relatives. When she saw me, she smiled and walked across the lawn. The gesture surprised me. Growing up, Natalie and I had never been especially close. Not because she was malicious, because my mother had quietly built a wall between us long before either of us understood it existed. Natalie had spent her life being chosen. I had spent mine being tolerated. Neither of us knew why. "Claire," she said warmly, hugging me. "I'm glad you came." I looked at her for a moment. She had no idea. No idea that everything she believed about herself was hours away from changing. No idea that the life she thought she understood rested on a foundation built by someone else's fear. "No matter what happens today," I said carefully, "I want you to remember something." She laughed lightly. "That sounds ominous. Just remember that none of this is your fault." Confusion crossed her face. "What isn't?" Before I could answer, another voice interrupted. "Claire." My mother descended the porch steps with the effortless confidence of someone who believed she still controlled the room. She wore a navy dress and pearls. Her posture was flawless. Her smile was flawless. Her performance was flawless. Only her eyes betrayed her. For the first time in my life, I thought she looked uneasy. Not frightened yet, just uneasy. Like someone hearing distant thunder. "You're early," she said. "I wanted some time at the house before everyone arrived." A tiny pause followed, barely noticeable. "Of course." I held her gaze. "Actually, I'd like to speak with you privately before the meeting starts." Her smile tightened. "About what?" "Grandma." The hesitation lasted slightly longer this time, then she nodded. "Fine." She led me through the front doors and into the house. The sounds of laughter faded behind us as we crossed familiar hallways lined with family portraits. Generations of Whitakers stared from the walls. Men in military uniforms, women in formal gowns. Children frozen in carefully arranged happiness. Looking at those photographs now, I couldn't stop wondering how many other stories hid beneath polished surfaces. My mother guided me into the breakfast room overlooking the river. Sunlight streamed through tall windows. The room was empty. The door closed behind us. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she crossed her arms. "What is this about?" I placed the folder on the table. Immediately her eyes dropped toward it. Not casually, instinctively. The reaction lasted less than a second, but it was enough. Recognition, fear, memory. Something. She knew. Maybe not everything, but enough. "You know what's in here," I said quietly. Her expression remained composed. "I have no idea what you're talking about." I slowly opened the folder. Not completely, just enough for the documents to become visible. I watched the color leave her face. It happened so quickly she almost managed to hide it. "Almost. Claire." Her voice sounded different now, tighter. "What exactly are you doing? Giving you a chance." She stared at me. I stared back. For the first time in 35 years, neither of us looked away. "A chance for what?" "To tell the truth yourself." Silence filled the room. Outside, laughter drifted across the lawn. Relatives enjoying lunch, family friends enjoying the weather, people waiting for a celebration. My mother looked at the folder again. then back at me. You don't know what you're talking about. I pulled the adoption record halfway from the stack. Arizona Family Court. Adoption proceedings. The words were clearly visible. Whatever composure she had left vanished instantly. Her eyes widened, her breathing changed. And suddenly I wasn't standing across from the woman who had spent decades controlling every family gathering. I was standing across from someone who realized the secret she buried had finally found daylight. "Where did you get that?" she whispered. "Grandma." The answer hit her harder than I expected. She sat down heavily. For the first time in my life, my mother looked tired. Truly tired. Not physically, spiritually. Like someone who had spent years holding a door shut and suddenly realized the lock was broken. "You shouldn't have seen this." There it was. Not an apology. Not concern for Natalie. Not concern for me. Concern that the truth had escaped. "You still don't understand," I said quietly. "Understand what?" This was never about protecting Natalie. Her eyes flashed. "You know nothing." "Then explain it." She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Nothing came out. Because there was no explanation that could justify 35 years. No explanation that could make a child responsible for an adult's fear. No explanation that could transform cruelty into love. "What did I do?" I asked. She blinked. "What? What did I do to deserve it?" The question hung between us. Simple, direct, impossible to escape. "I was your daughter. What did I do?" Her face changed. Not into guilt. Not completely. Something closer to panic. Because after all these years, she still didn't have an answer. A knock interrupted us. One of the caterers opened the door. "Mrs. Whitaker? Everyone's ready." The moment shattered. My mother stood immediately and straightened her dress. Piece by piece the mask returned. By the time she reached the doorway, the perfect hostess had reappeared. Almost. She stopped and looked back at me. Her voice turned cold. "If you do this today, you'll destroy this family." I thought about every birthday she forgot, every achievement she ignored, every holiday where I sat at the edge of the table. Then I thought about my grandmother, the one person who had always seen me clearly. "No," I said, "the truth will." For a brief moment, hatred flashed across her face, raw, undisguised. Then it disappeared beneath another smile and she walked out. I remained alone in the room for several seconds before picking up the folder and following her outside. The lawn was full now. Relatives occupied every table. Trustees from the Preservation Fund had arrived. Family friends stood near the river. Natalie sat beside my father beneath the largest tent. Samuel Price waited near the front, holding a leather briefcase. Everyone looked comfortable. Certain. Confident. My mother took her place at the head table. Natalie smiled beside her. My father adjusted his tie. Conversations slowly faded as Samuel stood. He opened his briefcase and looked directly at me. One question sat silently in his eyes. "Are you ready?" I thought about my grandmother. The cards. The doc. The letters. The years. Then I gave him a single nod. Samuel turned toward the gathering, cleared his throat, and spoke. "Before we discuss the distribution of Margaret Whitaker's estate, there is a matter of family lineage that must first be addressed." Every conversation stopped. Every face turned toward him. And across the table, my mother's face went completely white. The silence that followed Samuel Price's words felt alive. It moved across the lawn like a storm front. Conversations died mid-sentence. Glasses froze halfway to lips. Every face turned toward the front table. The river continued flowing behind us, indifferent to the fact that an entire family was seconds away from breaking apart. Samuel stood calmly beneath the white tent, one hand resting on his briefcase. My mother sat motionless beside Natalie. From where I stood, I could see the tension in her jaw. The color had drained completely from her face. For the first time in my life, Evelyn Whitaker looked like someone who had run out of exits. Samuel opened a folder and adjusted his glasses. "Margaret Whitaker amended her will approximately 8 months before her passing," he said. "She did so while fully competent and under independent legal supervision. Documentation supporting her decision is available for review." Murmurs spread through the crowd. My father shifted uneasily. Natalie frowned. My mother didn't move at all. "The Whitaker Preservation Trust and River House are not being distributed according to previous assumptions," Samuel continued. "Margaret attached a condition requiring confirmation of direct biological lineage before inheritance could pass." A cousin near the back laughed nervously. "What does that even mean?" Samuel looked up. It means Margaret believed evidence existed that required verification. The lawn grew quiet again. Every eye seemed to move between Samuel, my mother, and me. My grandmother had understood people well. She knew exactly where the truth needed to emerge. Not in private, not hidden inside legal paperwork. In daylight, in front of witnesses, where no one could quietly rewrite it later. My mother finally stood. "This is ridiculous." Her voice sounded sharp, controlled, desperate. Margaret was grieving. She wasn't thinking clearly near the end. Several people looked uncomfortable. Samuel remained completely calm. Medical evaluations confirming competency are included with the will. My mother ignored him. Her eyes locked onto me. "Claire." Just my name. The way she always said it when she wanted me to stop existing as an independent person and return to my assigned role. The difficult daughter. The silent daughter. The daughter who never challenged anything. "You knew about this." I met her gaze. Yes. The single word landed harder than I expected. The entire gathering seemed to lean forward. "Then tell them," she said. "Tell them what this is really about." I almost laughed. 35 years of being told to stay quiet, and now she wanted me to speak. Samuel looked toward me, not pushing, not directing, simply allowing the decision to be mine. My grandmother had done the same thing. She hadn't ordered me to expose anyone. She had handed me the truth and trusted me to carry it. I stood slowly. The movement felt strangely calm. Like stepping onto ground I had been walking toward my entire life. "Most of you know me," I began. "Or at least you think you do." Nobody interrupted. "For 35 years I've been told certain things about myself. That I'm difficult, independent, distant, that I don't need much. Those descriptions became part of my identity because I heard them often enough. My voice remained steady. What I didn't understand was why. Across the table, Natalie watched me with growing confusion. My father lowered his eyes. My mother looked ready to shatter. Several months before she died, my grandmother began investigating something she suspected for many years. I opened the folder and removed the adoption record. She was right. The paper trembled slightly in the breeze. Not from fear. From history finally changing direction. Natalie was adopted. The words landed with the force of an explosion. Gasps erupted around the tables. Someone dropped a glass. My aunt covered her mouth. Conversations immediately erupted before collapsing again beneath the weight of shock. Natalie stared at me as though she hadn't understood the language. "What?" The word barely escaped her lips. My mother took a step forward. "Stop." But her voice had lost authority. Panic had replaced it. "Stop this right now." "I didn't. You were adopted through a private placement in Arizona." Natalie looked at my father. "Dad?" He couldn't meet her eyes. The silence answered before he did. "Dad?" Her voice cracked. My father finally looked up. I had never seen him seem smaller. "It's true." The words barely emerged. Natalie physically recoiled. "No. Natalie. No." She stepped backward. "You're lying." My father began crying before she did. Quietly, almost invisibly. 35 years of silence finally collapsing under its own weight. "We adopted you," he whispered. "We loved you." Natalie looked between them. "Then why didn't you tell me?" Nobody answered. Because there wasn't a good answer. There never had been. My mother tried anyway. "We were protecting you." Natalie laughed once. A terrible sound. "Protecting me?" Tears filled her eyes. By lying to me my entire life, the crowd had disappeared from my awareness. The river, the tents, the relatives, everything blurred. The only thing that existed was the family at the center of the lie. "That's not the whole truth," I said quietly. Every head turned toward me again. My mother closed her eyes. She knew what came next. The adoption wasn't the reason Grandma changed her will. Natalie wiped tears from her face. Then what was? I looked directly at my mother. Because for 35 years, she treated her biological daughter like an outsider. Silence. Complete silence. Every time she looked at me, I continued. She saw evidence that the story she'd built wasn't true anymore. My Aunt Lillian stood. "That's enough, Evelyn." My mother looked at her sister. Betrayal flashed across her face. "You knew?" she whispered. "I knew some of it." Lillian's voice shook. "And I should have said something years ago." My mother suddenly looked exhausted. Not angry, not powerful, exhausted. Like someone who had spent decades holding up a wall and could no longer feel her arms. "You don't understand," she said. Tears finally appearing. None of you understand. Nobody responded. Because understanding wasn't the issue anymore. Truth was. I spent years trying to have a child, she said quietly. Years. Her voice cracked. Then we adopted Natalie. She became my miracle. Natalie flinched. And then Claire was born. My mother looked at me. For the first time in my life, there was no performance in her eyes. Only grief. And fear. And regret arriving far too late. Everything changed. I felt tears forming. Not because I forgave her. Because I finally understood her. Understanding and forgiveness are not the same thing. You looked at me, I said softly, and saw the end of the story you wanted. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Everyone knew. The truth stood naked between us. Natalie suddenly turned toward me. Tears streamed down her face. Claire. Her voice shook. I'm sorry. I blinked. You have nothing to apologize for. I should have seen it. No. My own voice broke. You were a child. She crossed the distance between us and hugged me. For a second, neither of us spoke. Two sisters, both victims of the same lie. Both carrying wounds neither of us created. My grandmother had been right. Natalie was never the problem. The lie was. Samuel eventually cleared his throat. Reality returning. According to Margaret Whittaker's amended will, River House and the Preservation Trust passed to Claire Whittaker. Nobody argued. Not even my mother. Because the inheritance no longer felt like the important part. The truth was, weeks later, after lawyers finished paperwork and relatives finished gossiping, I sat alone on the dock behind River House. Sunset painted the water gold. A familiar deck of cards rested beside me. My grandmother's final letter lay open in my lap. I had read it dozens of times. One passage remained underlined. You were never difficult to love. You were simply standing in the way of a lie. I stared across the river and finally allowed myself to believe her. The wound didn't disappear. Childhood wounds rarely do. But it settled, just as she promised. It settled somewhere solid, somewhere true. Natalie and I talk now. Real conversations, honest ones. My father calls occasionally. My mother has not apologized. Maybe she never will. Healing doesn't always arrive wearing the face we expect. Sometimes it arrives as acceptance. Sometimes it arrives as freedom. And sometimes it arrives as a realization that changes everything. The people who made you feel unworthy were often fighting battles inside themselves that had nothing to do with you. If you've listened this far, I want you to remember something. Maybe you were the child who never felt chosen. Maybe you spent years wondering what was wrong with you. Maybe you've been carrying a question nobody ever answered. If that's you, please hear me. The defect you're searching for may not exist. The thing you blame yourself for may never have belonged to you. Sometimes you're not standing in the shadow of your own failure. Sometimes you're standing in the shadow of someone else's secret. And if this story spoke to you, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your own experience in the comments. Tell us where you're listening from, and whether you've ever felt like the outsider in your own family, because the people sitting at the end of the table need to find each other. My grandmother spent her final months making sure I stopped sitting near the door. Now River House is mine. The dock is mine. The sunsets are mine. But the greatest inheritance she left wasn't the house. It was the truth. And the truth set down a burden I had carried for 35 years. I belonged all along. Maybe you do too.